and it's a great pleasure to welcome Harrison Stetler, who I will introduce in a moment, who's going to talk about collapsologie. What is it good for? But some housekeeping rules beforehand. For those of you who haven't been in on one of these before, please mute yourself or else James the dictator will mute you and turn off your video while Harrison is talking. And then after my introduction, he will talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll have questions in the normal way. And we invite you to put your hand up Zoom-wise by raising your hand, the little blue icon, and I will see who wants to ask a question and field questions, or you can ask a question through the chat function. And then we'll have question and answer session for about 15-20 minutes, and then we will wrap up. So it's a great pleasure, and I think very fitting to end with Harrison, because Harrison is actually a product of Columbia. And not only product of Columbia, but a product of the history department. And indeed, we crossed paths. So he's also a survivor. He has survived one of my seminars and lived to tell the tale. And he's also somebody who knows Reed Hall very well, because he studied there for some time during his BA, and then after that came to Paris to study at the École des Hautes Études, where he is currently studying and doing his master's, but also put those historical skills to good use by helping Brune in the archives put together the ongoing history of Reed Hall. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Harrison. I should also mention that he has almost immediately on arriving in France started to write a stream of extremely thoughtful analytic pieces for the New Republic and the Nation. And most recently, the blog post for the New York Review of Books on collapsologie, which caught my eye. And I thought there can be no better time to be an expert in the intellectual history of collapsologie than now. And we all need a bit of an education in what this is and how it can help us. So I'm going to hand over to you, Harrison, and look forward very much to what you have to say. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the Institute for extending this invitation. Thanks to James for handling things on facilitating things on the technical end. And I hope, I guess, as you've all sort of seen the title of this talk, I hope I'll make what is a rather gloomy and grim and almost depressing subject thought for some of these optimistic reflections. Before I get into the meat of the text I've prepared, I first want to just give a brief overview of sort of the structure of what I'm going to be discussing. First, I want to briefly introduce, at least for those of you who are not in France, or for those of you who are in France and who are perhaps not familiar with the thinkers that are broadly known as the collapsologues, and the place that they have in sort of the French environmental scene and the debates that these thinkers have caused in France in recent years, since I would say roughly 2015. Although, as I'll show later, I think this history and a lot of the ideas and the anxieties that these thinkers are giving voice to and are articulating get to some of sort of the key sort of environmental questions that have dominated thought, or at least have been present in modern political thought for well over a century now. So after this brief introduction of just what collapsologie is and who its main thinkers are and what their arguments are, I'll then briefly discuss, I guess, how I became interested in collapsologie as an environmentalism. This, in part, I think I need to discuss something I did not necessarily get to in my piece for the New York Review of Books, this particular sort of French context of these anxieties and of these debates. And then I want to sort of step back and place it in sort of a broader environmental history of modern political thoughts, and specifically in the late 19th century, when we start to have sort of the emergence, or when political thought starts to confront the reality of mass industrial societies, globalization, the uprooting of sort of traditional communities, pre-modern communities, and sort of the arrival of mass society. And then in my concluding third of my discussion, I actually want to place contemporary French collapsologie in what is, I think, another history, which is actually the history of collapsologie, which has not really, I guess, been written yet. And it's the history of what I think is romantic modernism. And I want to ask what this tradition has to teach us today. And then after that, we'll open up for a discussion. So here we go. One of the minor skirmishes in the very existential battle going on right now to avert humanity's collective self-asphyxiation from fossil fuel emissions is a semantic fight over the terms needed to make sense of our relationship with the natural world. All legitimate parties at least agree that this relationship is fraught. But some don't seem to realize that terms like global warming, climate change now ring hollow and are plainly inadequate to describe the scale of the crisis before us. We still hear talk of the green energy transition, of green growth, and these sorts of terms very much sort of dominate the language with which we think and which we imagine sort of the environmental question. But this domination, I think, though several decades old, has started to crumble, or is starting to be displaced in recent years by other questions. This and these sort of ideas of a green energy transition, of green growth, which has supposedly been going on for several decades now, this is even continues as fossil fuel extraction shows few signs of substantially abating, and as newer and more Promethean techniques for culling oil from the earth are being put into use. This from deep sea oil drilling to fracking, to plans to open up oil exploitation in the highest reaches of the Arctic. It is by now also a commonplace that development really ought to be sustainable. This, as each consecutive red line set by scientists and established at successive climate change conferences and successive climate change treaties hurdles closer. Social scientists and geologists have had endless debates over the meaning and implications of the so-called Anthropocene, a term which has become something of a buzzword in environmental debates. And it's a term which describes the geological epoch in which we supposedly now live, one in which the most minute processes of the Earth's system have as their origins human behavior. The Guardian newspaper well expressed what I think is this collective sense of confusion and vertigo when it announced in May 2019 that it was updating its style guide on its coverage of the environmental crisis. Instead of banal sounding and somewhat overused phrases such as global warming, it would use terms such as global heating. Instead of climate change, it would use phrases climate emergency, crisis, or breakdown. And now to turn to France. In France, the phrase effondrement, which translates to collapse, at the very least takes the cake when it comes to simplifying this rather confusing soup of terms. In French environmental debates, the term actually, effondrement, has become nearly ubiquitous. If you live in France, or in any way follow French intellectual life, if you've been in a French bookstore in recent years, if you read the opinion pages of Le Monde or other publications, you might have noticed the frequency in articles and book titles on the environmental crisis of words like collapsologie or effondrement. There are art exhibitions and major conferences that bear the name, aiming to describe what it will be like, and what it is already like for so many, to live through this perilous new phase of human history, characterized by environmental crises, from rising sea levels to crop failures to wildfires. Even as of this past fall, for the effondrement imaginary entered, I guess, the highest pinnacle of French popular culture. And there is now a TV series on the Canal Plus network titled Effondrement, which in a series of 8 or so 20-minute episodes dramatizes the worst of this present and future. If you're looking for something to watch in confinement, I strongly recommend that you perhaps take a look at it on the internet. So the main figure behind this new trend is a young environmental scientist turned public intellectual named Pablo Servigné, who published in 2015, alongside Raphael Stevens, what is probably the manifesto of the so-called collapsologues. The book is titled Comment tu peux s'effondrer, un petit manuel de collapsologie, which for English speakers amongst us translates to How Everything Can Collapse, a brief guide to collapsology. And I think there's a translation of the text coming out, I believe later this year from Polity Press. So what is the book's and the collapsologues' sort of main arguments? Well, to cut to the chase, modern thermo-industrial civilization, as they term it, is living through or is on the precipice of a societal breakdown. Resource shortages, global temperature rises, rising sea levels, soil depletion, population expansion, the rickety foundation or the rickety network that is our highly concentrated and intertwined global industrial civilization is entering or is about to enter its twilight terminal stage. Now, before I continue, I'd like to say that I actually have very little to actually say about this central claim, and I'm actually not necessarily interested in sort of having a debate, yes or no, on l'effondrement, and I don't necessarily think that that's actually what is interesting in this topic. I was actually somewhat hesitant when Mark actually proposed that I lead this discussion, largely out of fear of that one might actually think that I was myself a collapsologue. Actually, what I'm mostly interested in and what I want, I guess, or what my part of the discussion is going to be centered around are the origins and the history of collapsologie as a thought or as sort of a chapter in modern political thought and as a form of environmentalism. What can we learn from the fact that these thinkers exist? And I know there's a risk that comes from psychologizing the ideas of thinkers, and I guess that's a risk that I accept. But how does collapsologie, which I guess, is it a secular religion? Is it another weird political ideology? A sad denouement to the long list of illustrious ideas that have come out of Paris? What is collapsologie, or how does collapsologie emerge as a very, what I think, human response to the world in which we live today? And what can we learn from, by extension, what can we learn from the existence and sort of as I just showed, from the very wide diffusion of this response in contemporary French intellectual and popular culture? Oh, sorry, just briefly, there's some construction going on next door, so there might be the occasional sound of a drill, but perhaps take it as the charms of intellectual life in the age of social distancing. So to return to the collapsologues and their central thesis. In making this argument, and to bolster what amounts to sort of a rehashing of the cliches of millenarial thinking and Malthusianism, Servigné and Stevens define collapsologie as the transdisciplinary science of collapse. So to make these claims and these arguments, the collapsologues rely on an environmentally determined reading of human history. What we now call the environmental crisis is only the latest version of a very old and recurring phenomenon. Human history is cyclical, Servigné and his cohort argue. It's the story of the rise and the fall of societies and civilizations. And throughout history, one of, if not the key sort of variable in this sort of unending tragic cycle is the environment and the way in which human collectivities relate to natural milieux, to environments, and to ecosystems. Concentrations of people in power are based on economies of scale, which enables the seizure of a social surplus by a political and an economic elite. This leads to the overexploitation of natural milieux, which are refashioned as exploitable, productive backyards to make human society possible. Eventually, these natural foundations buckle and decay, and the forms of life on which they rested likewise collapse, and then the cycle sort of begins again. Well, a book that received a lot of attention in France when it was translated, I think the translation came out perhaps last winter or 2 winters ago or 2 falls ago, I think, during the peak of the Gilets jaunes crisis. A book that received a lot of attention in France, and particularly among sort of these collapsologue circles, was the recent essay by the American anthropologist James Scott, Against the Grain, A Deep History of the Earliest States. His book is a synthesis of studies on the civilizations of early Mesopotamia, and his ultimate argument is that the primary prism through which we must understand these societies and their fates is an environmental one. These were grain-growing societies, the first of their kind, based on surplus-seeking agricultural practices. But eventually, soils erode, the deforestation needed to clear agricultural terrain altered these societies' natural ecosystems and their environments, and the sort of natural foundations of a statelet or a small empire were eventually destroyed. I actually remember being particularly struck by Scott's discussion, for those of you who have read it, Scott's discussion of Genesis and his rereading of the story of Genesis from the First Testament, which he reads as a cultural reflection of the Stetler narrative. And I think when I discuss further on the ideas of the collapsologues, you'll hear these echoes. So in Genesis, Scott reads it as you have this nirvana state in which Adam and Eve live as something of the prototypical hunter-gatherers, knowing sort of no moral law but their own, which is the right moral law. So they live as the prototypical hunter-gatherers until they are swept from the Garden of Eden, and human history begins as a life of toil, external moral authority, the oppressive power of the collective and the state. Scott suggests that this actually reflects life as it was for millennia throughout the Neolithic period, with the development of states and their eventual demise, and sort of return to what he calls sort of golden ages of barbarians. Fossil records, he claims, shows that the communities of hunter-gatherers lived longer lives, had more diverse diets than were available to the populations living off the cash crop grains characteristic of sedentary communities, that these people were in fact taller and healthier, and that their moral life and their religion reflected sort of values of sort of moral autonomy and personal sort of the possibility of giving oneself and defining one's life, opposed to sort of the forms of religion that would develop in sort of mass grain growing states. So to return to the collapsologues, the collapsologues apply this cyclical environmental reading of history to today. Green transition, green growth, sustainable development, all of these sort of recent sort of ecological ideas and phrases, all these ignore the fundamental limits in the Earth system that even our highly sophisticated, technologically advanced society cannot overcome for long. In this regard, they represent, I think this is interesting, a revival of sort of the Malthusian tradition, which has somewhat receded, I think, from mainstream environmental debates in recent years. We sort of have long lived in a moment when discussions of the environmental crisis are largely limited or occupied solely by the question of fossil fuel emissions and the particle density of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. The collapsologues, however, I think, have a broader sense of what it means for society to overexploit its natural foundations. The question of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide, the degrees of warming over sort of the Earth's natural resting points during sort of the geological epoch of what is called the Holocene. All of these questions are what the collapsologues call the Earth's quote-unquote crossable thresholds. Crossable in the sense that we very well could heat the planet well beyond 1.5 or 2 degrees. And from the looks of it, it is unfortunately looking like it'll be very difficult to muster the political will to fulfill even the relatively modest goals of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. For the collapsologues, I think, their prognosis of collapse really comes from their primary interest in what they call the Earth's uncrossable thresholds. It's Malthusian sort of ingrained constraints, from finite quantity of rare earth metals needed for the high technologies on which technological solutions to global warming rest, to sort of 1970s-esque anxieties about the advent of peak oil and the global market destroying price surges that would follow in peak oil's wake. So what does all this mean for us? Well, according to the collapsologues, we need to develop rooted, or what they call bio-resilient communities, free from global supply chains. Those who follow French politics will be reminded of what is called the ZAD, or the Zone à Défendre, in Notre-Dame-des-Landes, which is a town near the city of Nantes in Western France. And just sort of to bring some people up to speed, in opposition to a long-planned attempt to build an expanded airport outside of the city, activists and farmers have been occupying for several years a large strip of land to prevent its development. So what the real meat of the collapsologues' answers to our problem sounds an awful lot like, I think, sort of the run to the hills, not to sort of make too much of a caricature of it. But they also make the implication, I think, following Scott, that we need to look at this as sort of some form of opportunity. We have the chance to recover the lost elements of our true human natures, which have been spoiled by years of abuse by an overbloated and oppressive industrial sort of mass civilization. There is, as you can probably tell, a good deal of classical sort of anarchist thought bubbling up again with the collapsologues. L'entraide, l'autre loi de la jungle, which translates to mutual aid, the other law of the jungle, was Servignier's 2017 essay on natural history that he co-authored with Gauthier Chapelle, sort of as a follow-up to the 2015 book, Comment tu peux s'effondrer. And he rehashes Pyotr Kropotkin's naturalism from his 1902 essay of the same title, Mutual Aid, a Factor of Evolution. Humans, like the broader natural web in which we belong, are naturally inclined toward benevolence, mutual support, and collective attempts to reduce suffering. Never mind the untold amount of suffering that will come through the collapse that these thinkers say is just around the corner or is already happening. Through the fire and flames, we'll recover these lost traits and build a society from it. So I guess that is my presentation, I think, of the main arguments of these thinkers. And I sort of want to step back a bit. First off, what are we actually to make of this? Is this not all just reactionary misanthropy and sort of millenarial eschatological thinking in disguise? Because having now introduced the main arguments of these thinkers, this sort of dispensation, or I think this collapsologue attitude, I'd like to discuss it in relationship to a sort of a broader environmental history of modern political ideas. To get into this portion of my talk, I'd also like to briefly discuss how and from what angle I became interested in this topic. I arrived in France in September 2016, as sort of a starry-eyed Bernie Sanders supporter. My conception of the essence of democratic or progressive politics still involved and still does involve such old-fangled words and ideas as, of course, progress, but also the seizure of power, collective emancipation, democratic equality, the welfare state, I guess the state for that matter, and internationalism. I assumed, and I still assume, that these terms in this language, though surely in need of some good renovation, some housekeeping and fine-tuning, was all largely more or less applicable to, could and would have to absorb the environmental question. When I first became aware of sort of the collapsologie craze in France, as I was sort of starting as a political journalist here, I'd actually just read Edward Bellamy's 1882 novel, Looking Backward, which describes a utopian city of Boston in the year 2000. For those of you who have not read the novel, I could not more strongly encourage that you add it to your COVID-19 reading list. Just to briefly sort of give a synopsis or a summary of the novel, Bellamy describes an ultra-modern future from the prospect of the late 19th century, with telephones, communal restaurants, department stores, on-demand radio. Even society's relationship with the natural world seems to have been perfected. When it rains, Bellamy describes a massive umbrella that is projected over and shields the city of Boston from inclement weather. Now, Bellamy's vision was, for me, and still is, a remarkably admirable description of a good society. Sure, he gets things wrong, but all in all, I think he's onto something very valuable, and I think he gives one of the purest articulations of probably what, in the 20th century, we would call social democracy, albeit definitely a radicalized, sort of more revolutionary version of what became social democracy. But he's on the mark, I think. He describes economic equality, access to the necessities of human life, such as decent food, housing, leisure. These are all human rights, just as voting and free speech and the freedom of worship are human rights, or sort of liberal subjective rights. More importantly, and what perhaps I think makes the novel almost comical to read at times, Bellamy also attempts to describe how that good society works. The public interest, the state, he writes, had been seized by the democratic forces at some point in the early 20th century. In this world, one is a student well into their mid-20s. After some necessary sort of menial labor in the general, what he calls industrial army, one chooses a profession. And then the extra credits that one earns by exercising a particular profession are inversely related to their desirability. In other words, those doing the most dangerous, the most physically demanding, and the most tiring labor are the best paid. But beyond that, every citizen enjoys what we would now call, and what I guess the revival or sort of the birth of this idea, and it's sort of spread in contemporary debates, both sort of the environmental discussion, but just also as a solution or as a possible policy to address economic equality. I think Bellamy, in his discussion of credits, he is articulating an early idea of sort of universal basic income. But what about the environment in all of this? I think the sort of the facile or the easy environmental reading of Bellamy would be to say that his vision of a democratic future promotes absolutely everything that is at the root of the current environmental crisis. And this would be the collapsologue critique. This is a society as told from the perspective of Julian West, an upper middle class Bostonian professional transported 100 years into the future. The good life for Bellamy and for Julian West is about getting the goods, and a lot of them, to as many people as possible. And what makes all of this possible is a society set up and thought of as one large, massive machine, manned by its industrial army. However, I think that this sort of reading misses a lot of the nuance both in Bellamy's thought and in sort of his articulation in this novel and related to his sort of journalistic writings. I think that Bellamy's vision is really at the roots of sort of proposed common sense solutions to the environmental crisis today, such as the Green New Deal. Bellamy was a journalist in Western Massachusetts in the 1870s, and he cataloged as something of a proto-environmental journalist the destruction to his home region caused by the creeping advance of modern industrialism. He discusses in a lot of his articles for sort of local newspapers in Western Massachusetts, he discusses the negative effects of deforestation and the risks of upsetting the regional climate that might come with it. He was obsessed with sort of how rainfall would be altered by sort of the felling of all the trees in the western part of the region. And he even goes so far in his essays as to call for the creation of something of a sort of a proto-environmental protection agency that would be created on the federal level to sort of regulate and to manage this society's exploitation of its sort of natural processes and milieu. As an interesting aside, actually, Bellamy was extremely influential in the 1930s, and specifically the Tennessee Valley Authority, which sort of the regional planning initiative in central United States under the New Deal, was the founder of the director of the Tennessee Valley Authority wrote Bellamy's biography in the 1930s during the sort of the Bellamy revival. Bellamy, I think, ultimately argues for an ironic position that the collapsologues can't seem to accept. Modern life and its liberties does, and we to a certain degree must accept this, does rest fundamentally on the unprecedented mobilization of natural resources, which necessitates, by extension, that humans seek to regulate the risks from destabilizing natural processes. I guess you can think of Bellamy's argument as sort of a two-part and partially tragic proposal. We need to protect individuals from the risks and the dangers of social life, unemployment, poverty, and this process of protecting them from sort of the vagaries and the risks of social life comes with protecting society from the natural side effects of this new conception of the relationship between the social world and the natural world. And I think it is this idea which is really the guiding principle behind such solutions as the Green New Deal today, which I think it's discussed a bit later. Whenever I spoke with sort of the major collapsologue figures in preparation for my Peaceful Europe review of books, they all were extremely critical of the Green New Deal as sort of as a solution to the current impasse. So to return to my initial introduction to sort of collapsologie in France, the ideas found in Bellamy's book were the kinds of things that I started talking about and still like to talk about with many French people my age and in my circles, people who are interested in the environmental crisis, people who have probably read and who have read the collapsologue writers, students, teachers, journalists, activists, people who are, in short, interested in politics. But I occasionally got the impression that we were talking at cross purposes. I learned that I was roughly describing a rehashed, albeit radicalized version of the 20th century social democracy. I learned that that whole experience had failed once and for all, and did I know that the state and any politics which actually hopes to seize it was irredeemably corrupted and doomed to failure. These were, back in 2016 when I first arrived in France and started researching and reading these writers, these were the last years of the Hollande presidency. The Socialist Party had failed terribly again, despite claiming that my enemy is finance. Hollande had kowtowed to calls for further economic liberalization and had resorted to more fiscal austerity. Now, the point of this brief, I guess, personal detour, which is not really something I get into my article, is to discuss what I think are, I guess, the contemporary origins or the political context of collapsologie in France. Neoliberal globalization has upended the mass social democratic movements and the institutions that they created, and that so characterized European politics throughout the 20th century. I think hanging over the collapsologue imaginary and what makes it palatable as a reaction to the current situation is, I think, a very frightening prospect, namely that sort of the major political and economic institutions in France, in Europe, in the United States have been seized and perhaps, or what they would claim, indefinitely seized by the wealthy and the powerful and the corporations that they own. As an environmentalism, I think that the collapsologie trend is only too imaginable in a decade that has seen the defeat of left-wing populist parties such as Syriza in Greece, to say nothing of the final erosion of the old social democratic forces. So it has been out of this context, coupled with the rising public attention to the environmental crisis and sort of the rising awareness of the inadequacy of what is passed for political solutions to the environmental crisis, is out of this context that the collapsologues have grown. The collapsologues tell the story that after all the environmental devastation and chaos and misery and perhaps mass genocide, they tell the story of a revival. Even these institutions and structures that control so much in our lives and that define our lives, those institutions through which progressives formerly thought our emancipation, unions, international organizations, all of these organizations would too be destroyed and would buckle because of the environmental effects of global industrialism. After all of the suffering, first from neoliberalism's advance, and then from the worsening effects of global warming, there was a hope, and it was to be found in the pastoral communities that would, in some way, shape, or form, we would be forced to live in. So beyond what I think is their sort of general, I guess, moral blindness and passivity to the future that they describe and to the reality of what actually that future would get to, this actually gets me to the only real place where I think that the collapsologues are wrong. These large organizations and institutions are not going anywhere. In fact, they're digging in, they're entrenching themselves, preparing to deal with, survive, and profit from shocks, be they environmental disasters, economic crises, and now in the age of COVID-19, public health crises. Very tellingly, in my conversations with collapsologues like Pablo Servigne or Yves Cochet, who was Lionel Jospin's environmental minister in the early 2000s, I actually often got shrugs and scorn when I mentioned books such as The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. In a sense, the negative response to these thinkers, to a thinker like Naomi Klein, is understandable. Her book and her work as a journalist reveals the lie behind their entire philosophy of history and their prognosis of sort of an imminent redemptive event that will clear the way, that will clear away the institutions at the root of the global warming crisis, from fossil fuel corporations to the governments in their pockets. Through the language of corporate governance, the line even between the formal states and these private economic actors is dangerously fading away. What comes to mind today is the partnership between, for example, New York State and former Google chairman Eric Schmidt to, quote, reimagine life with the coronavirus. Amazon has become, for the professional middle classes of the advanced industrial world, something of the fifth branch of government, thanks to its tentacular reach and ability to keep the flow of goods going, while brick and mortar stores are forced to close. What Klein's book, which I've read as a much needed antidote to collapsologie, what her book reminds us and demands of us is that we take power seriously. Progressives and Democrats the world over need to think seriously about seizing power and need to have a plan for it, and have a plan to do once, and have to have a plan for what they will do once they have power. They need to reflect what prevents them from having power right now, and they above all can't place their bets on a salutary reshuffling of the decks from an environmental catastrophe. That being said, and this is sort of where I want to transition to the third portion of my discussion. That being said, what is, I think, the deeper lesson of the collapsologie phenomenon? I just discussed the origins of its sort of rising influence in the breakdown of both the social democratic sort of social egalitarian vision as articulated by Edward Bellamy in the late 1880s, but also of sort of the social democratic prospects of responding to the environmental crisis, namely this coupling of social protection and environmental management and sort of environmental management and protection from environmental risks. In this final section, I want to discuss sort of the deeper lessons, I think, of the collapsologie phenomenon. I want to put this trend and these thinkers in what is, I think, a broader history of collapsologie. I guess my sort of preliminary hypothesis is that a lot of these currents and these ideas are as old as sort of modern political thought, to say nothing of just Malthusianism, which of course goes back to the early 19th century and the history of political economy. The collapsologues could of course be written as just another chapter in the revival of the Malthusianism, but I think there's something on an even deeper level that I find interesting and worth our reflection. The feeling of collapse, of breakdown, is an essential component of the modern experience. This is Marshall Berman's argument in his classic study of modernist art and literature published in 1982, titled All That Is Solid Melts into Air. Now, the title of Berman's book comes, of course, from the famous line in Marx's Communist Manifesto, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned. It's all that I remember from it. But it as a chapter of this history, sort of modernism and the modern experience, or perhaps of modern emotions, that I think we ought to make sense of the collapsologue. Despite, or rather perhaps because of their sort of nostalgic reveries and their neo-pastoral ramblings and sort of their prophecies of an imminent collapse, the collapsologues are, I think, and perhaps unwittingly, quintessentially modern. Marx and Berman, of course, were focused on the withering of feudal and pre-modern life before sort of the inexorable advance of the machine, the metropolis, and modern individualism. These old worlds are now all but long gone, of course, but with the environmental crisis, all that was solid is again melting into air. The fabric of modern life that has emerged and settled over the ashes of sort of traditional pre-modern ways of life now risk themselves being overwhelmed by the breakdown of its natural foundations. Now, there have been two answers, I think, this is following my reading of Berman, there have been two answers to this experience of modern life as collapse. And I think that these two answers reflect respectfully what is valuable and horrifying in the collapsologue imaginary. Berman writes that sort of the reverse side of this experience of breakdown or of collapse is the attempt to make a home in the modern world. This attempt to carve out a home in a world without solid ground can of course take many forms. He at the same time criticizes and admires the likes of Le Corbusier and Robert Moses, sort of the quintessential figures of technocratic utopianism, who dreamed of massive 20th century urban planning projects that aimed to seize modern dissipation by its horns. But he also discusses and admires the modern urban dweller, from Baudelaire to the Black graffiti artists in the Bronx, who sprung out of the destruction left in the wake of Baron Haussmann's and Robert Moses' attempts to remake Paris and New York. Now, I think the collapsologues actually give voice to this desire to make such a home in a world which appears as if all that is solid is indeed melting into air. And I think that they recognize more than many other environmental thinkers just how difficult that will be through all the coming and already existing environmental carnage. In fact, a good example of a proto-collapsologue is none other than William Morris, who wrote in 1883 a novel-length reply to Edward Bellamy titled News from Nowhere. Morris's novel is a defense of the very human need for rootedness and of its very real emancipatory power. His utopia is pastoral, artisanal, and analog, describing just the world being destroyed by Bellamy's machine society and its industrial army. Yes, economic rights are important, and we can't imagine a democratic just society without them, and Bellamy was right in that regard. But there's also a right or a very human need for embeddedness or rootedness to feel one's creative reciprocal impact in the world that surrounds them. Now, I think Morris and by extension the collapsologues, are part of this sort of long and invaluable and often forgotten tradition in progressive thought. We could call it perhaps romantic modernism. The difficulty, of course, is that it's very hard to define or say just what this rootedness might be. They seem to create sort of this philosophy of history at which point we'll arrive at this sort of rooted stage only after sort of the breakdown of everything that we assume and take for granted today. Now, the difficulty is, of course, that it's very hard to define or say what this actually would be, let alone to create a politics beyond sort of individual initiative or voluntarism that would make this possible. In fact, the people who do most of this talking and who are able to sell the idea in an easily packageable form often peddle a bastardized version of this as sort of national purity or a pastiche moral authority. Now, the other answer to this experience of modern life as sort of collapse and breakdown is, of course, nihilism and misanthropy. And in their ability, I think, to flippantly accept all the mass misery that will supposedly inevitably come with what they claim as the imminent sort of apocalyptic effondrement. The collapsologues no doubt display these tendencies as well. Now, to remind us of just how old this response to the feeling of collapse is, I'll take another literary excursion to conclude to the 1880s. Ibsen's tragedy An Enemy of the People premiered in Oslo in 1883. It tells the story of Thomas Stockman, who was a doctor in a spa town in fin de siècle, Norway. And when I sort of read from the passages, and as I describe the plot of the story, I want you to note sort of the proto-environmental motifs and themes in the play. So having made the discovery that the city's new hospital complex, Thomas Stockman is the doctor in the spa town, and their sort of what's the term? Yeah, the spa, the sanatorium in this town. So he's made the discovery that the city's new hospital complex draws its water from a polluted source upstream and in proximity to a network of mine shafts. When he makes this discovery, Stockman resolves to alert the citizenry and ensure the needed repairs. Stockman cries, and I quote, "The whole bath establishment is a whited poison sepulchre, the gravest possible danger to the public health. All that nastiness up at Moldal, all that stinking filth is infecting the water in the conduit pipes leading to the reservoir, and the same cursed, filthy poison oozes out on the shore too." Ultimately, Stockman's faith in political reform is quashed. His brother, the town's mayor, leads the opposition and denies the impending public health disaster, bribing and intimidating journalists and other concerned citizens into silence. The play ends with Stockman descending into a state of delirium, dreaming of returning to the northern reaches of Norway, where the life of a true and autonomous individual is still possible, free from sort of the mediocrity of the masses. And I love the phrase in An Enemy of the People. He talks about the compact majority to describe sort of the collective state of mind of the citizens in this town. In the conclusion of the play, and in a bout of misanthropy, Stockman shouts, "What does the destruction of a community matter if it lives on lies? It ought to be razed to the ground. I tell you, all who live by lies ought to be exterminated like vermin. You will be infecting the whole country. You will bring about such a state of things that the whole country will deserve to be ruined. And if things come to that pass, I shall say from the bottom of my heart, let the whole country perish. Let all these people be exterminated." And on that cheerful note, I guess I'll stop and open to discussion.
Thank you very much, Harrison. That was fantastic and immensely rich. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, and maybe while people are collecting their thoughts, I can ask you something myself. You presented collapsologie as a inherently unpolitical, maybe even anti-political doctrine, at least as I read it. It was true that it could be connected up genealogically to forms of prior environmental socialist thought that had a more political edge, like William Morris. But what strikes me in your telling of it is how resolutely unpolitical it is. I mean, if you study Balkan history, the idea that you are going to idealize the life of the isolated mountain community is preposterous. And in fact, the tensions between different kinds of agrarian community are hardwired into history from the start. There isn't a utopian idyll. So this is all anti-historical. So a couple of questions arise from that for me. It seemed to me at certain points that you were hinting at the presence in these texts of what you might call a kind of apocalyptic glee. This is the feeling that intellectuals might have that nobody is listening, and that the world deserves what it's going to get. And by the way, it's going to be the better off for it afterwards, true. But in the meantime, there is this kind of slightly gleeful edge, and I'm curious about that. And it would seem to come out of the Ibsen to a certain extent too, which might be a reflection of the position that these writers feel themselves to be in. And that brought me to my second question, which is, what does it say about France in particular? Given the crisis of the left that you describe, that this should be popular?
No, I think that's a very good question. I didn't quite discuss as much as I would have liked, but I really do think that there is a very strong French context to this story. I guess perhaps my perspective is a bit warped by the fact that I study at a French university, and I'm sort of largely in contact with, I guess, intellectual life as it exists, or sort of intellectual and political life as it exists in, I guess, the specific context of a French university. And I'm particularly shocked by just the extreme degree of pessimism that reigns amongst a lot of sort of my friends and peers, specifically coming from the United States. And I somewhat feel silly giving lessons to sort of the French political scene as, I guess, an American, and we all know what is happening in the United States right now. But, and I often discuss this with my friends here, I know that there are no figures, or there's sort of no sort of very few ideas that, I guess, inspire people or necessarily can speak to people in the way that perhaps figures like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have sort of galvanized a very broad swath of sort of at least the rising sort of democratic or progressive generation in the United States today. There is a very sort of large void in France, I think, of sort of figures or at least forces that could channel or articulate a sort of political situation, a political solution to a lot of these problems. I think back to sort of the French context and this very specific, flight. I think flight from political reality or from sort of the political scene, and I think yes, this somewhat apocalyptic glee. I do think that the memory of sort of the defeat of social democracy in France is a much more recent story. I guess I mentioned François Hollande, and not saying François Hollande was by no means, I guess, what somewhat a figure like Mitterrand was in the early 80s. But I think it's really important to remember that with sort of the turn to neoliberalism in the 1980s, in France, the history looks very different. The history is a story of defeats, at least on the from the perspective of the French left. The history is a story of betrayal. At the same moment when Thatcher and Reagan come to power in the United States, you have a figure like François Mitterrand who comes to power and promises to take French society in exactly the opposite direction. So I think it's really out of sort of, it's the long effects of this sense of betrayal that is really at the root of a lot of this phenomenon. And it definitely reminds one of Marx again, sort of all the memory of the past weighs like a nightmare. And I think a lot of the defeat of sort of French social democracy is everywhere when we think of the collapsologue trend.
Thank you. So listen, we're going to open this up for questions. If you have a question, just raise your hand. And I will field questions or ask via the chat function. So the floor is really open if anybody would like to ask something. Well, let me go on while maybe other people will want or not, we'll see. But while we're talking, so this notion of crisis, you say it's comparable to Marx. Could you say more about this? This image of the crisis, how it's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how precise it is.
The collapsologue.
Yes, and I mean, in the case of Marx, there is a historical account and a logic behind it.
And as a historical actor,
and a historical actor.
Proletariat.
Yes.
I think it is rather vague, and it's. I mean, in the books, in Comment tu peux s'effondrer, for example, you have what is a very, I think, invaluable and realistic sort of summary of all of the very serious sort of natural processes that are being fundamentally altered by human activity. So I guess I think these are things I think that have largely entered much of the debate today, from sort of melting of the Arctic permafrost, obviously effects of sort of reduction of biodiversity, declining crop yields. I guess we sort of now know a lot of these sort of natural processes and have an idea of them, or at least they have largely entered the political debate. But as far as what this sort of event or what this crisis would look like, I mean, there's not necessarily an idea of, no, they don't necessarily say on day one there will be sort of the sky will burst and there will be the collapse. It's about sort of a series of sort of accumulating sort of loops that will sort of in one moment lead this sort of very fragile structure to collapse. But no, it's very vague, and I think it's largely on an article of faith.
And could you say something about Pablo Sevigny's own background, either intellectually or politically?
So he has a scientific background. He studied sort of animal behavior. Has a PhD from Liège in Belgium, and specifically his doctoral dissertation was on communal behavior in ants and in ant populations. I've not unfortunately read a copy of his dissertation, but I would be quite interested to take a look at it. But it is interesting, at least when you look at a book like L'Entraide, The Other Law of the Jungle, Mutual Aid, The Other Law of the Jungle, you see sort of his attempt to naturalize human behavior and the impact of his sort of scientific biological background.
And is there any consciousness of the debt to Kropotkin and the whole 19th century tradition of utilizing supposed biological truths for the sake of political philosophy?
Of course. No, I mean, Salvinier, when I spoke with him, is extremely well-read, both from sort of on the entire sort of scientific side of the question, but also in terms of his political culture and his sort of literary culture of sort of classic 19th century, I guess, anarchist philosophy and the relationship between scientific researchers or scientific theses like Kropotkin's, absolutely. And I mean, the title of the essay was an allusion to the 1902 essay.
Right. Well, I think we're on the hour. Okay, we have a question from Lindsey Schram. So, Lindsey, why don't you reveal and unmute yourself, and please feel free to ask your question.
Hello, Harrison.
Hello.
Good to see you. So I don't have the same background as I'm sure a lot of people here do, and I'm not 100% sure.
We can't hear you.
Oh, really?
Now we can.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me hold this up. So I'm not sure first that I understood everything that you were still. I'll write it.
Okay. While Lindsey is writing, let me invite Stuart to ask his question, and then I'll come back, Lindsey, to your question.
Sort of, this is from the science point of view, since I guess I'm the unofficial scientist here. I'm particularly interested in this reference to the work on ants that he had done, and I'll just quickly recommend a newer book on this called The Human Swarm by Mark Moffat, who's a leading entomologist and studies ants. One of the things that Mark points out, it's a large book, so I don't want to summarize it anyway, but one of the things that Mark points out in this book is that there are very few species on the planet that exist in troops or societies or groups in which there are a vast number of unknown individuals. Ants being one of them. Their societies include millions, but they yet know who is a member and who isn't. But even our closest evolutionary relatives, chimpanzees, live in troops no larger than 150. That's the maximum size, in which members may know who's in the 150, but really only have a close group among them. We, on the other hand, used to walk down streets full of millions of people, and do this almost everywhere, and even in small villages and so forth. People live closely and with groups of people that are strangers. I'm always reminded of this in restaurants. I mean, we're willing to sit in a restaurant with a group of strangers who are armed to the teeth with sharp utensils, and yet we do this without any worry or concern. So I think from a biological point of view, we're destined to live in these large societies. That's what we do somehow or another. And if that results in collapse, then so be it, I guess. But I don't think there's a way around that from a scientific point of view. So I'm sort of surprised that somebody studying ants would have thought that. And I just, as a last thing, bring up what I originally intended to ask a question about was where the work of somebody like Hans Rosling, which I know is sort of on the, well, not really on the fringe, but very popular. His books like Factfulness and so forth, and the way human beings so quickly get things wrong statistically about how awful things are and how much better they are than we actually tend to believe they are, which is not a Pollyanna notion or anything like that. There's room for improvement, but I just wonder what the attitude of collapsologists are to that. Sorry,
well,
so
I've not read his
questions packed into one.
I guess to respond to your second question, I haven't read his work, but I believe he is cited in the second essay between sort of the text on mutual aid and the first sort of the manifesto, which is called Une autre fin du monde est possible, another end of the world is possible, which is largely about sort of the psychology of how humans relate to disasters, and specifically sort of getting over, it's somewhat, I think he even bills it as somewhat of a self-help book on dealing with and accepting the realities of cataclysmic change. I don't, I guess, have the exact references or how he deals with that text, but he is answering or asking those questions in a lot of his writings.
That's worth looking up. Okay, thanks.
So I have Lindsey's question, Harrison, which is about the idea of a public commons and how the collapsologue think about public commons. Are all institutions considered to be problematic, or only those that have been co-opted by corporate interests? That's the question.
Well, I would say it's very vague. I think there is, and I don't think they would necessarily have a rule of thumb necessarily. And also, I don't want to give sort of too much of a negative characterization of sort of their political perspectives. I mean, I think he and these thinkers do embrace sort of a law that would be passed, and they would embrace laws that would be passed by sort of, if we just imagine the European Union have the ability or have the wherewithal to entirely clamp down on the oil majors in the European Union. Of course, they would embrace sort of activities like these or policies such as these, but there is, I think, I mean, it's sort of the classic, I think, sort of anarcho-syndicalist tradition in France of suspicion towards institutions with which one is not entirely sort of embedded in or is not sort of an active member in. There is I think an animosity towards questions of scale or delegation of responsibilities and representation that is very deeply rooted in this tradition. As far as where the actual sort of line is, I wouldn't necessarily be able to say, but if that entirely responds.
And then Harrison, we have one more question from Devashri, which asks whether you see any connections between the collapsologie and American transcendentalism, you know, in the idea of a certain belief in retreat or the return to a more authentic way of life in nature and so on. Are those, do you think those?
Absolutely, and definitely in the sort of the pantheon of collapsologue inspiration or sort of intellectuals, I would say, yeah, Thoreau, the transcendentalists have a major place. William Morris, certainly. I would say Simone Weil as a philosopher looms very large. Sort of fast forward into the 1970s, and I guess maybe back in sort of the American transcendental sort of new left tradition, a writer like Ernst Callenbach, who wrote something actually of a response to Bellamy's novel 100 years after the fact, a very wonderful little novella called Ecotopia, which describes sort of this future in which the Northwest of the United States has seceded from the Union and has created something of sort of this sort of transcendental, authentic, sort of Shaker style communities in the American Northwest. So no, there is very much I guess I said there's a French context to this, but as far as the intellectual heritage, it's extremely actually un-French in a lot of respects. This is not the Jacobin sort of vision of sort of the emancipatory states and sort of the equal sort of fraternal republic at all. There is sort of this American kind of, I use the term antinomian background, I think, to a lot of these writers, which somewhat belies the fact that they are sort of French, or this is sort of a French intellectual trend. So no, absolutely, there figures like Thoreau are smack dab in the middle of sort of their intellectual forefathers.
So Harrison, I think, thank you so much. I think we're going to probably leave it there. We're approaching the end of our time. For those of you who this leaves thirsty for more political discussion, on June the 2nd, we are going to be linking up to the Maison Française for a discussion between Patrick Boucheron and Jeffrey Friedman in French on Boucheron's new book on Machiavelli. And that will be at 1 o'clock EST. So join us for that. But this was the last rendezvous de l'Institut of this year. And I would like to thank you enormously, Harrison, for taking the time and coming and talking with us about your work today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Harrison, for being with us today. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.